if I may, it's been amazing over the years to hear you offer recollections of your familiarity with Pirzadi Nur Nisa, the days that you spent together and your memories of her. I wonder if you would be willing to offer a few reflections regarding your own father, Sheikh Mashaik Mahaboob Khan, who was so close to Murshid and whom we know, especially through his music, the compositions that bespeak his very soul and which are a precious legacy that has come down to us and which is newly being revived now. But he's such a little known figure because he was very internal. Of course, he upheld his responsibility dutifully and served as a leader of the Sufi movement for many years. But there was something almost mysterious about him, precisely because of his mystical depth. And I wonder if you can convey something of his essence and help us to better understand his spirit and who he was and how his legacy lives on still today.
Thank you for that. That is indeed a difficult thing to respond to, precisely because his being had so many different aspects, but all of them were so subtle, so hidden in his personality, that one has a feeling when you describe one thing, it's only too one-sided, and you leave out too much things which also belong to that composite picture. But in very general terms, the interesting thing is I'm reminded of the recollections of Theo van Horen, who writes that he came to Suresnes several times, and he came to know, already in Murshid Inayat Khan's time he came, and then he came to know Murshid Inayat Khan's brothers, that is to say, the cousin brother Murshid Ali Khan and the parental brother Musharraf Khan, came to know them very well. And then to his surprise, he heard it was still another brother, even a brother who was, the eldest of the parental brothers, and he really had never seen him. And I wonder, how is this? Yes, that Mahaboob Khan, I know the name, but I don't know the person. And so a whole discussion develops that Mahaboob Khan is the one who loved to withdraw himself into meditation or into composition, and that fully took up his attention in the early days. And then, of course, he had also very much that idea that Murshid Inayat Khan being there, and after Murshid Inayat Khan himself, his magnetic teachings were there. And so he should not cast his shadow either on the teachings, and certainly not in any way assert himself in the presence of Murshid Inayat Khan. So he was perfectly happy to withdraw, and his meditations and his music, in a sense, were his life. Now he has also the one characteristic which was typical for him in comparison to the other three brothers, Murshid and the other two I just mentioned, that he was very, very reserved. He didn't express himself or his feelings very easily, and in that way he was a product of two different currents which contained that in the first place, of course, the moral tradition, which tried to not to express its feelings and its values in any kind of uncontrolled way. They could be expressed where it was appropriate, but it should not be a kind of emotional stream of expressions which you find in many different countries in the Mediterranean and in Asia. So in contrast to that, there was that kind of keeping oneself completely composed. And of course, then in addition to that, that was another current which came into India, was the British stiff upper lip, which of course again was a kind of similar thing. And that British influence came to him very strongly from the uncle who had studied in England and become very much Anglicized, Dr. Alauddin Khan Pathan. And so these two currents kind of reinforced that kind of characteristic which he already carried within himself. So now the interesting thing is, he had a wonderful way of if he were in the mood, if he were really in that attunement, his condition, speaking about either Sufism or about Hazrat Inayat Khan or about the values they shared. He was a wonderful speaker, but always in private. In public, he really felt he ought not to stand at the place where Murshid Inayat Khan stood. What he only could do, he would just cast, as I already said, his shadow on the words and the person of Hazrat Inayat Khan, who he revered so greatly. And so in public, he also had that kind of embarrassment of expressing himself. But in personal interviews, in collective interviews, and also meeting with murids with whom he had a certain personal relationship, and sometimes in the great receptions that were given during the summer schools at Surin, when really he started his stories, he started speaking, then all other conversations stopped and everybody would listen in attention to what he had to say. But, and then people asked him, Shaikh, you have so much, you know, you have told so much, why don't you write your memoirs? And then he used to say, but my memoirs are in my songs. His songs were his memoirs. And if you know that, if you see his songs and look at the chronology of his songs, you see that many of them match certain vital events in his life. And so that was his contribution, both to the biography of the four brothers together, to his own experience of life and his own spiritual development. It's all there. And so in that beautiful shape in his songs, that his whole personality finds full expression. So that is the most striking thing, I think, about him. Further, the wonderful thing is, on the one hand, he had that kind of, contrary, as I said to the other three brothers, that kind of reserve in general approach in meeting people, etc., which also corresponded to a certain sense of withdrawal in himself. But at the same time, that was matched by an enormous warmth of heart. If one touched his heart, if we had a connection with his heart, then his affection, his loving kindness, his commitment to others could simply be overwhelming. That was one side of his character that needed to be discovered. And those who discovered that really became his very great admirers, but also loved his way of teaching and of simply of being. Because, of course, teaching is fine. And the higher and the better teachings you give, the better it is. But as Murshid Inayat himself conveyed and also himself represented, teachings themselves are simply a testimony of an inner illumination. And what is conveyed by words, what is conveyed by teachings expressed in one way or another, is simply a conveying something of an inner illumination, which through those words, through those things, is conveyed to the person who opens himself to that which is to be given. That is that whole principle of fana, opening up oneself to that which goes beyond the words, beyond the impressions, but which is a conveying of an inner attunement, divine focus transmitted to those who are open for it. So that was also typical of his way of conveying Sufism. And then, of course, in his own practice, P.S.E. already mentioned that. He and Murshid Ali Khan, who lived in with us also, greatly to our joy. And very often the two of them would be together. Murshid Ali Khan traveled much more than Shaikh Mashaik Mahaboob Khan. But if we were there, the two of them would sit and spend generally speaking, from 10 to 12 every day in meditation. And this in itself was a wonderful experience, because in the first place, the room where they sat was completely isolated. The curtains were drawn. Nobody was ever allowed to come in. And then for the first hour or so, there was a kind of very musical recitation. They used to recitate the traditional prayers. They used to recitate everything which people otherwise carry outwards, but they were carrying them inwards. Even those prayers which people naturally do, they would just sit and do them in a meditative spirit. And after that had finished, after half an hour or maybe somewhat more time, then there was a complete silence. And in that complete silence, they had gone from those prayers which they had recited into the depth of their meditative conditioning. And so that went on for 2 hours like this in the morning. And precisely the same thing happened in the evening. And from 8 to 10, everything was in that way very carefully timed also. From 8 to 10, they would sit and again have these 2 hours of meditation. Again, first a certain amount of recitation, which sounded very beautiful. And then after that, that complete silence, which had such a strength of atmosphere that even after their time, people used to come reads and would still want to be there in that same room where they had done the meditation, just to absorb that atmosphere. And even people who had nothing to do with Sufism, who didn't even know people who were, what people were living in that house. When they came there, they were struck and said, what a strange kind of atmosphere it is here. They would express it in different ways according to their own understanding, but you would feel that there's something which is quite out of the ordinary. So that created that wonderful atmosphere in their lifetimes, and that is strong enough to continue quite a while after their lifetimes as well. And yes, I suppose that was a kind of fulfillment of its own of what Murshid's teachings had to bring, could convey, and could further reach in those people who are really fully attuned to what he has to give. Now, of course, one might ask the question, to what extent do you have to have that kind of attunement, not only that in order to gain that inner attunement, to, let us say, the soul illumination of these great mystics, how do you attune to your best? What kind of cultural factors need to be met in order really to be able to assimilate all that they had to convey? You see, it was all something which, especially the leading followers at Murshid Inayat's own time, realized very well, was that the very fact that the brothers and the cousin brother of Murshid Inayat Khan had been culturally and socially so very close to him, in a psychological sense, in every conceivable way, they were attuned to the life which Murshid Inayat Khan in India led himself. And that kind of sameness of cultural and psychological experience, of course, enormously facilitated the absorption of Murshid Inayat Khan, what Murshid Inayat had to give. You probably know that Murshid Inayat Khan was trained in Hyderabad by his own Murshid for 3 or 4 years. He trained his brothers during the whole so-called London period, from 1914 till 1920, practically every night. Played every evening for 6 years. They underwent that continuous meditative training. So that, of course, they became like the most authoritative conveyors of that which Murshid had to share. And then the question is, how can you transmit something of that psychological attunement, of that cultural attunement, in such a way that it makes it easy for the murids in search of these inner realities, to ease for them that going inward by having a kind of outward attunement which will facilitate that. And of course, that's an ongoing question in which every generation will have to find a new solution. But trying to achieve that is, of course, one of the points of collecting murids in a kind of joint circle, in an organization, a kind of structure which can hold people together, and so it of itself create a certain kind of ambiance, a kind of atmosphere, a kind of evocative spirit in which it is made easier for people to attune themselves to that inner realities as Murshid and his brothers experienced them. Again, too many words to convey something quite simple, but there you are. I'm sorry.
So inspiring, Sheikh al-Mashayikh.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think we're reaching our time together. It's coming to an end. I'd just like to say thank you so much for finding this time. You mentioned at the start that you were dealing with some other things, and I thank you so much for coming and joining and answering so many different questions.
Thank you very much for the patience in listening to all that. I have a bad reputation of talking too much. And actually, my wife tends to tell me that whenever she asks me a question, by the time I have finished my answer, she has forgotten what the question was. So I hope you people have not suffered the same dilemma. And then we have a bad reputation for loquacity. And so I should really thank everybody for their patience. And it's, of course, extremely stimulating to receive questions, because from the questions you learn more than you could ever teach anybody else. So in that sense, getting questions is a very, very fruitful process for the person who is, obliged to answer them. But above all, also, I would thank Zia for such a busy schedule and such a fully occupied life, for being with us, giving us this opportunity, giving this wonderful and wholly undeserved introduction, and his support in this wonderful question, because the remembrance of Mashaik Mahaboob is one of the precious elements for us as a family, but also for Sufism in general, as that example that somebody who is fully attuned what it is possible really to achieve through Murshid Inayat's teaching and an example of his personality. So thank you so much, Bizia, for all this which you gave us today and giving us all the time always.
Thank you so much, Sheikh al-Mashaik. It's been a tremendous honor and blessing for all of us. And this hour, I know, is going to stretch out into hours and hours. It's going to stretch out into an eternity, because it's going to live on in our hearts for the rest of our days and beyond. So we're very grateful to you. And in closing, may I ask you, could you give a word of blessing? Just bless us.
It's not for me to bless anyone. Murshid Inayat is the one who blesses all of us. And might I then conclude with those words which convey all of Murshid Inayat's being, all of his Sufism, in these first simple words of the Psalm hymn. Psalm hymn, which is often known as the prayer psalm. And psalm, in fact, means, of course, Rosa, the fasting. And we know that the Muslim fasting month has just started. Muslims have been exchanging with another the Ramadan Mubarak. May you have a blessed time of fasting. But Psalm, in this sense, is also to fast in the sense of, as the Sufi would say it, giving up every attention to anything outside, and only fully focusing on the divine reality in the depths of one's soul. And that is expressed very concisely, but with enormous force, in these first words, which I would like to recite with you together in that prayer or in that hymn called Psalm, which really expresses everything. So if you allow, let me transmit this blessing of Murshids to all of you, to all of us, and may they carry their illumination in your hearts at all times, inshallah. Just this. Praise be to thee, most supreme God, omnipotent, omnipresent, all-pervading, the only being. Take us in thy parental arms, raise us, above the denseness of the earth. Amen.
Thank you.
Birzia, will you please give us our au revoir?
Dear friends, au revoir. À bientôt. Khoda Hafiz. As-salama. I hope to see you again soon. Let's look for a chance to be together soon. Meanwhile.
Inshallah. Thank you so much.